You are standing on a rain-slicked ridge in the high, jagged hills of Satsuma at the southernmost tip of Japan, just as the final hours of September 23rd, 1877, bleed into the cold gray mist of dawn. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, bruised ferns, and the sharp metallic tang of spent black powder that has hung over these valleys for months. Below you, the world is shifting in a way that feels permanent, heavy, and irreversible. In the distance, the low rhythmic thrum of modern, Western-built steamships echoes off the waters of Kagoshima Bay, a steady, industrial heartbeat that sounds entirely alien against the ancient silence of these mountains. It is the sound of a new age arriving, ruthless and impatient, completely indifferent to the world it is about to crush underfoot. You can feel the wet grass soaking through your straw sandals, the biting chill of the autumn wind cutting through a stained, threadbare silk kimono that has seen too many campaigns. Around you, tucked into the shallow earthworks and the shadows of the cypress trees, a few hundred men are waiting in absolute, agonizing silence. They do not look like an army anymore. Their armor is gone, replaced by blood-soaked bandages. Their masterfully forged swords are notched, dulled, and stained with the grim work of a desperate, months-long retreat. These are the last of the samurai. They are men who were born to a code that ruled an empire for 7 centuries, an intricate moral landscape where honor was heavier than a mountain and death was as light as a feather. Yet, as you look at their hollow cheeks and their tired, unblinking eyes, you realize they know exactly what sunrise will bring. They are surrounded by an imperial army, 40,000 strong, equipped with the latest European rifles, modern artillery, and a cold, bureaucratic directive from Tokyo. Ensure that the old world dies here, on this ridge, before the sun reaches its zenith. You notice a massive figure sitting quietly on a wooden stool near the center of the camp, seemingly untouched by the panic that usually precedes an execution. This is Saigo Takamori, to the Western world, reading the morning dispatches in London or New York. He is labeled a rebel leader, a traitor to the very emperor he once helped place upon the chrysanthemum throne. But to the men who look to him now, he is something far vaster. He is the living soul of an era that is being systematically erased from the earth. He is a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, his large, deeply expressive eyes staring not at the advancing enemy lines, but into the shifting fog. There is no anger in his face. There is no frantic plotting, no desperate prayer for a miracle. Instead, there is only a profound, crystalline stillness, a silence so absolute that it seems to quiet the very wind howling through the pines. You begin to understand that this entire war, this bloody, tragic rebellion that has torn Japan apart for the past 8 months, was never truly about winning a military victory. Saigo is too brilliant a strategist to have ever believed a few thousand swords could halt the march of industrial iron. This was never a bid for power. It was a protest. It was a silent, agonizingly loud statement, written in blood, designed to ask a single, haunting question to a nation rushing headlong into modernity. When you strip away your past, when you trade your soul for iron warships and foreign suits, who are you? Saigo chose to die not because he hated the future, but because he loved the men who had no place within it. He wanted to give the samurai class a death that meant something, a final, beautiful tragedy that would burn itself into the national consciousness forever. serving as a permanent anchor for a country danger of losing its bearings. The silence on the ridge grows heavier as the first faint lines of purple light begin to crack the eastern sky. The distant rumble of Imperial artillery starts to warm up, a low mechanical growl that signals the end of the night and the beginning of the final assault. The contrast is sharp and agonizing. On one side stands the New Japan, uniform, mechanical, efficient, and fueled by coal and imported iron. On the other side stands Saigo's world, poetic, deeply personal, rooted in centuries of localized loyalty and bound by a tragic devotion to an ideal that the world has outgrown. As the first artillery shell screams through the mist, tearing through the canopy of trees above, nobody flinches. The men look to Saigo, and he simply nods, a quiet, gentle gesture that signals it is time to move toward the end. You are stepping backward through time, away from the smoke-choked ridges of Shiroyama, down into the quiet, humid valleys of Kagoshima, as they existed half a century earlier. The year is 1828. Here, the air does not smell of industrial coal or western black powder. It carries the scent of salt water blowing off the bay, the rich, dark volcanic soil of Mount Sakurajima, and the sweet, lingering perfume of blooming cedar trees. This is the capital of the Satsuma domain, a place isolated from the rest of Japan by geography, by pride, and by an ancient, unyielding martial tradition. It is a world governed not by modern laws, but by the strict, rhythmic pulse of the seasons and an absolute, unbending devotion to the warrior caste. You find yourself outside a small, unassuming wooden house in the lower-class samurai quarter of Shitaji. The roof is thatched, dark with age and dampness, and the paper-sliding doors are patched with cheap scrap paper to keep out the biting winter winds. This is the home of the Saigo family. Inside, there is no luxury, no fine porcelain, no silk screens of golden landscapes. Instead, there is the quiet, grinding reality of poverty. The Saigo clan belongs to the Goshi, the rustic, low-ranking samurai, who are essentially warrior farmers. They possess the right to wear 2 swords and carry a family name. But their daily existence is a constant, exhausting struggle against debt, bad harvests, and the rigid hierarchy of the upper-class officials who rule from Kagoshima Castle. You watch a young boy moving through the small rooms of this crowded house. His name is Saigo Kichinosuke, the child who will one day grow up to be called Takamori. Even now, in his earliest years, he is completely impossible to miss. He is massive, far larger than any of his peers, with broad, heavy bones, thick wrists, and large, dark, intensely expressive eyes that seem to absorb every detail of the world around him with a quiet, solemn intensity. He is the eldest of 7 children, and in a household where food is scarce, and every copper coin must be counted twice, the weight of responsibility settles onto his broad shoulders. Before he even understands what the word truly means, you see him giving up his own small portion of sweet potatoes to his younger brothers and sisters, wrapping himself in a single, threadbare blanket during the freezing winter nights so that the smaller children can stay warm. You begin to see that Saigo's character was not forged in a vacuum of philosophical theory. It was hammered out in the cold reality of this small, struggling home. He learned very early that power was not something to be used for personal comfort, but a heavy burden to be deployed for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. His father, a low-level bureaucrat who kept financial records for the domain, was a man of quiet dignity who taught his sons that a true samurai's wealth is measured not by the gold in his purse, but by the depth of his sincerity and his willingness to endure hardship without complaint. This was the concept of meiyo, honor, not as an abstract poetic ideal, but as a practical, daily discipline of self-sacrifice. You follow the young Saigo as he enters the Goju, the unique educational system of the Satsuma domain. In these local youth associations, there are no adult masters or formal school teachers in the Western sense. Instead, the older boys teach the younger boys, passing down knowledge, physical conditioning, and moral discipline in a closed, intensely loyal brotherhood. You watch them gathered in an open courtyard as the sun beats down on the packed dirt. They are studying the ancient Confucian texts, reciting passages about the duty of a ruler to his people and the absolute necessity of righteousness. But this is not an academic exercise. The words are immediately put into practice through grueling physical trials. They run barefoot through freezing mountain streams. They practice Jigen Ryu, the brutal, uncompromising sword style of Satsuma, where a warrior trains to kill his opponent with a single, devastating downward strike, screaming a terrifying, guttural war cry that echoes off the hills. You witness a pivotal, traumatic moment that will alter the course of Saigo's life forever and leave a permanent, physical mark upon his body. During a dispute between local youth factions in the neighborhood, swords are drawn in the heat of passion. A young Saigo steps between the angry combatants, his natural instinct to protect overriding any thought for his own safety. In the chaos, a blade cuts deep into the crook of his right elbow, severing the tendons and muscles. The wound is severe, bleeding profusely onto the dusty ground. Though he survives the injury, the scar tissue heals poorly, leaving his right arm permanently stiff and weak. For a boy born into a society where mastery of the sword is the ultimate measure of a man's worth, this is a catastrophic, existential blow. He will never be able to hold a sword with the perfect, fluid grace required of a frontline duelist. He will never be the classical, agile warrior of legend. You observe how this physical limitation forces Saigo to turn inward, transforming a potential tragedy into the source of his true greatness. Denied the path of pure physical dominance, he pours his immense energy into the cultivation of his mind and his spirit. He becomes an insatiable reader, devouring books on history, governance, agricultural economics, and military strategy. He turns toward the teachings of Wang Yangming, a Chinese Neo-Confucian philosopher whose ideas had taken deep root among the reform-minded samurai of Japan. This philosophy, known in Japanese as Yomegaku, preached a radical, dangerous doctrine that true knowledge and action are inseparable. To know a thing is right and not to act upon it is the ultimate form of cowardice. Conscience, not the arbitrary laws of a corrupt government, must be a man's final authority. You watch as this internal, philosophical fire begins to manifest in Saigo's first public role. At the age of 18, he is appointed as an assistant tax collector, an agricultural official in the rural districts of Satsuma. This is where he leaves the safety of the town and enters the dark, hidden underbelly of the domain. You walk with him along the narrow, muddy ridges of the rice paddies, watching him interact with the local peasantry. These are the people who actually feed the samurai class, yet they live in a state of perpetual, heartbreaking misery. They are bent double under the weight of exorbitant taxes, their skin darkened and leathery from a lifetime of brutal labor under the sun, their bellies swollen from hunger, while the granaries of the wealthy lords are bursting with grain. You see the profound, radical empathy that begins to define Saigo during these years on the land, where other samurai officials see only numbers on a ledger or simple peasants to be exploited. Saigo sees human beings of immense dignity who are being systematically crushed by a broken system. He refuses to enforce the harshest tax penalties against families that are starving. He sits on the dirt floors of their humble huts, drinking cheap, bitter tea with them, listening to their grievances, and using his own position to quietly alter records, defer debts, and secure relief grain for villages on the brink of famine. He becomes a legendary figure among the poor of Satsuma, a giant samurai who possesses the heart of a gentle mother, a man who cannot witness suffering without trying to carry it upon his own back. You observe that this deep connection to the earth and its people creates a profound contradiction within Saigo's soul. He is a loyal servant of the Satsuma domain, yet he is becoming deeply disillusioned with the corrupt, stagnant bureaucracy that runs it. The central government in Edo, the Tokugawa shogunate, has ruled Japan with an iron fist for over 250 years, enforcing a policy of total national isolation and a rigid caste system that has frozen the country in time. But beneath the surface of this enforced peace, the foundations are rotting. The local lords are deep in debt to wealthy merchants. The samurai are becoming soft and indebted, and the peasantry is restless, desperate, and angry. You sense a growing, electric tension in the air as the decade of the 1850s approaches. Rumors are swirling through the port towns of strange, massive black ships seen off the coast, ships propelled by fire and steam, carrying heavy guns that could obliterate the wooden defenses of Japan in a matter of hours. The old world, the world that nurtured Saigo's childhood and defined his sense of duty, is about to collide with the unstoppable, terrifying force of the modern West. And as you watch Saigo, standing on the shores of Kagoshima Bay, looking out at the vast, empty ocean, you can see in his eyes that he knows the quiet days of his youth are over. The world is calling for men of immense stature, men who can step into the storm and reshape history. And the long, slow-burning preparation of Saigo Takamori is finally complete. You are thrust into the suffocating, high-stakes corridors of Kyoto and Edo during the turbulent twilight of the 1850s, an era known across Japan as the Bakumatsu. The shattering of the curtain, the absolute silence of Saigo's rural youth is gone, replaced by a chaotic, electric atmosphere of political conspiracy, midnight assassinations, and the profound terror of foreign colonization. The Western powers have forced open the gates of Japan. Their black iron warships sit anchored in the bays, their guns trained on the ancient towns, demanding trade treaties that threaten to reduce this proud island nation to a helpless vassal state. The centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate, paralyzed by fear and internal decay, is crumbling from within. The air smells of rain-soaked wood, expensive ink used to draft secret treaties, and the cold sweat of men who know they are playing a game where the penalty for a single misstep is the executioner's blade. You watch Saigo Takamori emerge from the rustic isolation of Satsuma onto this grand, terrifying national stage. He is no longer an obscure agricultural official. He has been discovered by Shimazu Nariakira, the brilliant, visionary lord of Satsuma. Nariakira is one of the most progressive minds of the century, an industrial pioneer who understands that if Japan does not modernize its military and unify its fractured political structure immediately, It will fall victim to the Western empires, just as China did during the Opium Wars. Nari Akira sees in the massive Quin Kufimai Morin Inabue quiet Saigo a man of rare, incorruptible sincerity. He lifts Saigo from the lower ranks of the warrior caste, making him his personal attendant, his eyes, and his ears in the imperial capital of Kyoto. You see Saigo moving through the shadows of the ancient court, meeting with radical samurai from other domains, philosophers and court nobles, serving as the trusted instrument of a grand plan to reform the nation from the top down. You experience the crushing, devastating blow that shatters this rising trajectory and plunges Saigo into the darkest abyss of his life. In 1858, Lord Nari Akira dies suddenly of an illness, leaving Satsuma in the hands of conservative, hostile regents who despise Saigo's radical political connections. Almost simultaneously, the shogunate launches the Ansei Purge, a brutal, systematic crackdown against anyone advocating for imperial reform or political change. Saigo's closest friend and political ally, a brilliant monk named Gesho, is marked for death by the shogunate's secret police. Together, Saigo and Gesho flee Kyoto, pursued by assassins, and make their way back to Satsuma, hoping for sanctuary. But when they arrive, the new rulers of the domain turn their backs on them, refusing protection and ordering that Gesho be expelled, which is a death sentence in disguise. You are present on a freezing, moonlit night in November when Saigo and Gesho board a small wooden boat on Kagoshima Bay, realizing that their dreams for the nation have turned to ash and that honor permits no retreat into cowardice. They sit across from one another in the dark, the black silhouette of Mount Sakurajima looming over them like a silent tombstone. They exchange a final, poignant poem, a farewell to a world that has rejected them. Then, without a word, they stand up, embrace each other, and cast themselves into the icy, black depths of the ocean. It is an act of shinju, a double suicide born of political despair and a refusal to live in dishonor. You watch the frantic splashes in the dark water as the boatmen scramble to pull them out. Gesho's lungs are filled with water. He is gone, his spirit slipping quietly away into the sea. But Saigo's massive, powerful frame resists death. His heart refuses to stop beating. He is dragged back onto the boat, half dead, coughing up salt water, coughing up the bitter realization that he has survived while his dearest brother in arms has perished. You witness the cruel, agonizing punishment that follows this tragic survival. The Satsuma authorities, wanting to hide Saigo from the shogunate's investigators while punishing him for his radicalism, banish him to Amami Oshima, a remote, subtropical island far to the south. Later, after a brief, turbulent recall, where his uncompromising moral principles clash directly with the new ruler of Satsuma, Shimazu Hisamitsu, he is banished a second time to Okinoerabujima, a desolate, windswept coral rock in the middle of the ocean. Here, he is confined to a tiny, open-air bamboo cage, exposed to the blistering tropical sun, the torrential monsoon rains, and the swarms of biting insects. The dampness settles into his old sword wound, causing his arm to stiffen painfully. His massive body wastes away from malnutrition and tropical fever. You look closely into that bamboo cage, expecting to find a man driven mad by isolation, betrayal, and physical torment. Instead, you find a man undergoing a profound, miraculous spiritual transfiguration. Denied everything else, Saigo turns his prison into a monastery. He spends his days in intense, silent Zen meditation, sitting perfectly still for hours despite the flies and the heat. He reads the ancient texts over and over until the pages tear, scribbling commentaries with a crude brush. It is during this absolute isolation that Saigo refines his core philosophical motto, Kaiten Aijin, revere heaven, love mankind. He realizes that his survival in the ocean was not an accident. Heaven has preserved his life because he has a grand, unfinished destiny to fulfill for the people of Japan. The suffering in the cage burns away the last remnants of personal ambition, vanity, and fear. When he is finally recalled to Satsuma after years of exile because the domain desperately needs his unmatched strategic mind, he steps out of the cage not as a broken prisoner, but as a sage wrapped in the skin of a warrior, a man completely detached from his own survival, making him the most dangerous and powerful political force in the empire. You follow Saigo as he takes supreme command of the military forces of Satsuma, stepping back into a national arena that is now screaming for revolution. He forms a secret, historic alliance with Choshu, a rival radical domain uniting the two most powerful military forces in Japan against the shogunate. In 1868, the Boshin War erupts. You watch Saigo lead his modernized, disciplined Satsuma troops through the smoke of battle, crushing the shogunate's armies with a brilliant combination of Western tactics and traditional samurai ferocity. He marches on Edo, the shogun's grand capital, an enormous city of over 1 million souls. The entire city is on the brink of an apocalyptic conflagration. The shogunate forces are dug in, ready to burn the metropolis to the ground rather than surrender it. You enter a quiet, tense room on the outskirts of Edo, where Saigo sits face to face with Katsu Kaishu, the commander of the shogun's forces. The destiny of Japan hangs on a knife edge. Katsu Kaishu expects a ruthless conqueror, demanding unconditional surrender and blood. Instead, he looks into the large, calm eyes of Saigo Takamori and finds a man of immense sincerity who deeply wishes to avoid the needless slaughter of his countrymen. Relying purely on mutual trust and a shared love for the nation, they negotiate a peaceful, bloodless surrender of Edo Castle. The city is saved from destruction. The shogun steps down from power, and the old feudal order that had ruled Japan for 2.5 centuries vanishes without a catastrophic civil massacre. The emperor is restored to supreme political power, moving his court to Edo, which is renamed Tokyo. Saigo has achieved the impossible. He has broken the old world, brought down the shogunate, and stood at the absolute pinnacle of revolutionary victory, celebrated as the chief architect of the Meiji Restoration. He has climbed from a penniless, low-ranking samurai house through exile and the jaws of death to become the most powerful military figure in the newly reborn Empire of Japan. You are walking through the wide, unpaved streets of Tokyo in the early 1870s, a city caught in the throes of a frantic, almost hysterical identity crisis. The ancient metropolis of Edo, once a quiet bastion of feudal order, has become a chaotic laboratory of westernization. Everywhere you look, the past is being torn up by its roots. Telegraph lines stretch across the sky like giant spiderwebs. Cutting through the view of Mount Fuji, steam locomotives chug and hiss through fields where rice had been planted by hand for 1,000 years. You pass government officials walking briskly to their ministries, their traditional top-knots chopped off, dressed in uncomfortable wool frock coats and leather boots that pinch their feet. The old samurai swords, once revered as the very soul of the warrior, have been outlawed in public, replaced by the modern walking cane. The air smells of coal smoke, cheap foreign liquor, and the raw, wet plaster of new European-style brick buildings rising from the ashes of old wooden estates. You find Saigo Takamori sitting in a modest, sparsely furnished office within the new Imperial Palace complex, a massive island of psychological isolation in the middle of this glittering, superficial storm. He is now the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Army and the de facto leader of the central government, while a grand delegation of his colleagues, including his childhood friend Okubo Toshimichi, is away in America and Europe on the Iwakuni mission, studying Western institutions. Saigo holds the absolute pinnacle of political and military power in Japan. Yet, as you observe him in this office, you see a man who has never looked more profoundly alone. He refuses to wear the elaborate, gold-braided European military uniforms that his fellow officers flaunt. He prefers a simple, coarse cotton kimono, often mended at the sleeves. He refuses to ride in horse-drawn carriages, choosing instead to walk through the muddy streets to work, carrying his own umbrella, while other ministers use their new positions to build palatial Western-style estates and enrich themselves through corrupt contracts with emerging merchants. Saigo lives in a small rented house, spending his massive salary to support destitute veterans and fund schools for poor children. You begin to feel the immense, suffocating weight of the crown that Saigo wears during these chaotic years. He has realized that the revolution he helped unleash has transformed into a beast he can no longer control or recognize. He did not fight the shogunate to turn Japan into a second-rate copy of Victorian England. He fought to create a nation of moral purity, an empire where the ancient spiritual values of honor, sincerity, and duty would guide the government, while modern technology would merely serve as a shield against foreign aggression. Instead, he sees a new class of career bureaucrats emerging in Tokyo, men who have never bled on a battlefield, men who measure national progress solely by the number of factories built, the volume of trade balances, and the accumulation of personal wealth. The samurai class, the 700,000 warriors who had formed the backbone of the nation's culture and identity for centuries, are being systematically destroyed by legal decrees. Their stipends are being stripped away, their social status abolished, and their traditional role as the defenders of the realm replaced by a conscript army drafted from the peasantry. You witness the growing, electric tension within Saigo's soul as he receives thousands of letters and visitors from across the country, destitute samurai who have been forced into poverty, unable to feed their families, humiliated by a government they helped create. They look to Saigo as their last hope, their single voice within the halls of power. This internal crisis reaches an absolute, explosive climax in 1873 during the historic debate over Korea, an event known as the Sekanron. Korea has refused to recognize the new Meiji government, insulting the Japanese emperor and closing its ports to trade. For the radical samurai class, this is an intolerable insult to national honor, an insult that demands a military response. They see a war with Korea not as an act of senseless aggression, but as a grand, final mission for the samurai class, a way to restore their purpose, redirect their dangerous domestic frustrations outward, and prove to the world that the traditional martial spirit of Japan is still alive and vital. You enter the Grand Council chamber, where the Meiji government is split completely in two, a ideological battlefield where lifelong friendships are torn apart forever. On one side stands Saigo, arguing passionately for a diplomatic mission to Korea. On the other side stands his closest childhood friend, Okubo Toshimichi, who has returned from the West, convinced that Japan is far too weak industrially to risk an international war that could provoke an intervention by Russia or Great Britain. But it is Saigo's radical, deeply disturbing proposal for this mission that reveals the true, desperate state of his mind. He volunteers to go to Korea himself, completely alone, as an imperial envoy. He explicitly proposes that he will deliberately provoke the Korean court into executing him. His assassination will provide Japan with a completely undeniable, morally righteous casus belli, a clean, justified reason to launch an invasion. You look at Saigo as he delivers this proposal, and you realize with a chill that this is not the strategy of a politician or a conqueror. It is the ultimate expression of a tragic, self-sacrificial philosophy. Saigo does not want to conquer Korea. He wants to die. He wants to die a beautiful, purposeful death that will unite his fractured country, give the samurai class one last glorious campaign, and allow him to escape a modern world that he feels is rotting his spirit. He sees his own life as a currency to be spent for the honor of his people. For months, the debate rages through the government, paralyzing the state. Saigo initially wins the approval of the council, but Okubo uses every bureaucratic trick, every backroom political manipulation, and the direct intervention of the emperor to overturn the decision, canceling the mission. You observe the final, quiet break that alters the course of Japanese history. When the decision is overturned in October of 1873, Saigo does not argue. He does not launch a coup in Tokyo, though the army would have followed him blindly. Instead, he simply stands up, resigns from every single one of his high government positions, and walks out of the palace. He strips himself of power as easily as a man discarding an old cloak. Within days, hundreds of his loyal officers and soldiers from Satsuma resign their commissions as well, abandoning the imperial army to follow their commander. You watch Saigo board a ship at Yokohama, turning his back on the smoke and brick of Tokyo, heading back south to his native mountains of Kagoshima. He returns to the land not as a conqueror or a rebel, but as a broken-hearted sage who has tried to carry the weight of an entire era on his shoulders and has found that the march of time is an unstoppable, crushing wheel. He enters a self-imposed exile, seeking the quiet of his farm, the companionship of his hunting dogs, and the solace of the volcanic earth, completely unaware that his return to Satsuma has just lit a fuse that will soon detonate the entire nation. You are returning to the deep, secluded valleys of Kagoshima in the mid-1870s, where a dangerous, parallel reality has quietly established itself, far from the watchful eyes of the Tokyo bureaucrats. Here, the air feels heavy, pregnant with the silent, vibrating tension of a gathering thunderstorm. The modern westernized world of trains and frock coats has been entirely shut out. In these mountains, the old world has dug its trenches, pulled its traditional headbands tight, and refused to budge. You pass through village courtyards, filled with the sharp, rhythmic thwack-thwack of wooden practice swords striking bamboo targets. The men training here are not the conscript peasants of the new imperial army, They are classical samurai, their top knots intact, their eyes burned clean by a fierce, uncompromising sense of betrayal. You watch Saigo Takamori moving through this rustic landscape, living the simple life of a retired gentleman farmer, yet finding himself completely unable to escape the gravity of his own legend. He has established a network of private academies known as the Shigako, funded by his own remaining wealth and supported by the local government. On paper, these are schools meant to teach young men traditional Confucian ethics, agricultural science, and modern military strategy. In reality, they have become a sovereign, independent warrior state within the empire. Over 20,000 young, disaffected samurai from across the country have flocked to Kagoshima, turning the Shigako into a massive, highly disciplined paramilitary organization that effectively controls the entire Satsuma province. They collect the taxes, they enforce the local laws, and they openly refuse to recognize the authority of the Tokyo administration. Saigo spends his days hunting in the hills with his dogs, fishing in the quiet rivers, and sitting in the dirt with his students, drinking sweet potato shochu and discussing ancient philosophy. He does not plot a treasonous rebellion. He is waiting, watching the inevitable, tragic trajectory of history unfold with the detached, melancholic eye of a Zen master. You witness the fatal spark that explodes this delicate equilibrium in the opening weeks of 1877. The Meiji government in Tokyo, watching the growing military power of the Satsuma academies with mounting panic, decides it must dismantle the stronghold before it is too late. In absolute secrecy, they send a transport ship to Kagoshima under the cover of night to covertly remove the massive imperial munitions and gunpowder stores kept at the local arsenals. Simultaneously, Saigo's students capture a band of undercover police officers sent from Tokyo into Kagoshima. Under brutal, unyielding interrogation, the leader of these agents confesses to a terrifying plot. They have been dispatched by Okubo Toshimichi's ministry with direct, explicit orders to assassinate Saigo Takamori. You are present in the crowded hall of the Shigako when the news of this assassination plot and the theft of the ammunition is brought directly to Saigo, who has just returned from a hunting trip in the snowy mountains. The radical young leaders of the academy are screaming for war, their hands gripped tightly on the hilts of their family swords, their faces contorted with rage. For a long, agonizing moment, Saigo sits in absolute, monumental silence, his large, deep eyes staring down at the floorboards. He realizes with a crushing clarity that his hand has been forced. He knows his students have committed an act of open treason by raiding the government arsenals to stop the munitions transfer. He knows that Tokyo will never negotiate, and that his lifelong friend, Okubo, is ready to deploy the entire weight of the modern state to crush them. Most importantly, he knows that a military victory against an industrialized nation of 35 million people is a mathematical impossibility. Yet, as he looks up into the desperate, trusting faces of the young men who see him as their father, his sense of total loyalty overrides his survival instinct. He utters a simple, fateful sentence that seals his destiny. Well, it seems my body is yours to do with as you please. You follow the vanguard of the Satsuma army as they march out of Kagoshima in February of 1877. stepping directly into one of the most brutal winters the region has seen in decades. A heavy, blinding blizzard blankets the mountains, wrapping the ancient pines in a thick shroud of white. Saigo marches at the center of this column, not riding a war horse like a grand general, but walking on foot through the deep drifts, wrapped in a simple wool cloak, his stiff right arm tucked into his sash. He has chosen a title for his campaign that reveals his true intent. He is not leading a rebellion against the young Emperor Meiji. He is marching to Tokyo to question the government and rid the sovereign of the corrupt, self-serving ministers who are destroying the nation's soul. His army is a strange, beautiful, and terrifying hybrid. They carry modern repeating rifles and a few field guns, but every man also carries his ancestral katana slung across his back. They march with an absolute, fanatical discipline, believing that the pure, unyielding warrior spirit of Satsuma can shatter the conscript armies of the state. You watch this revolutionary momentum come to an abrupt, disastrous halt before the massive black stone walls of Kumamoto Castle. This ancient, impenetrable fortress is held by an imperial garrison of peasant conscripts armed with modern repeating rifles and backed by heavy Western artillery. Saigo's advisors assure him that the peasant soldiers will flee in terror the moment they hear the blood-curdling war cry of the Satsuma samurai and see the flash of their naked steel. But they are tragically, catastrophically wrong. Behind the safety of modern stone earthworks and barbed wire, the conscripts stand their ground. They pull their triggers with mechanical precision, unleashing a continuous, devastating wall of lead that rips through the charging samurai ranks, turning the pristine white snow into a horrific, steaming mire of crimson mud and shattered bones. Saigo's offensive stalls, transforming into a grueling, static siege that breaks the back of his campaign. You witness the turning of the tide as the immense, industrial power of the modern Japanese state is unleashed upon the rebels. The Tokyo government pours 40,000 fresh, highly drilled troops into the theater, supplied by steamships and coordinated by telegraph lines that allow commanders to reposition regiments instantly. Day after day, week after week, the sky over Kumamoto is black with the smoke of an endless artillery bombardment. The war becomes a meat grinder, stripping away the romance of the old ways and replacing it with the cold, scientific reality of modern attrition. The Satsuma samurai perform miracles of legendary bravery. They launch desperate midnight sword raids into the imperial trenches, severing limbs and terrorizing the lines. But for every imperial soldier they kill, 3 more arrive on the next train from Tokyo. You follow the agonizing, months-long retreat as Saigo leads the bleeding, battered remnants of his army backward through the jagged mountains of Kyushu, pursued relentlessly by an enemy that never runs out of ammunition or men. The campaign has become a slow, systematic execution. Saigo's brilliant commanders are killed one by one in obscure mountain passes. Their modern rifles are ruined by rain. Their gunpowder is exhausted, and they are reduced to carving wooden spears and wielding rusted swords against gatling guns. Saigo himself is silent, enduring the physical agony of a worsening illness and the psychological weight of watching the children of his friends die by the hundreds in the mud. By August, the grand army of 20,000 has withered away to just a few hundred, exhausted, starving ghosts. Yet, there is no talk of surrender. They are bound together by an unspoken, sacred understanding. They are going home to Kagoshima to die on the very soil that birthed them, bringing the grand tragedy of the samurai era to its final beautiful sunset. You are stepping out of the smoke of the mountain passes and returning to where this tragedy began, on the sacred, bloody slopes of Shiroyama, the mountain that cradles Kagoshima in its ancient shadow. The date is September 23rd, 1877. The world has shrunk down to an agonizingly small patch of earth. The grand army that had marched out in the winter snow, with polished weapons and flying banners, has been reduced to exactly 372 men. They are holed up in a series of shallow caves and crude dirt trenches near the summit of the ridge, completely surrounded by an iron ring of 40,000 imperial troops. The contrast between the two forces is no longer just a difference in numbers, it is a gulf between two entirely different dimensions of human existence. Below the ridge, the modern world is illuminated by the harsh, unnatural glare of military lanterns and the sparks of telegraph wires linking the frontline tents directly to the desks of power in Tokyo. On the mountain, there is only the flickering light of a few dying wood fires and the cold, indifferent stars overhead. You walk through the dark caves where the remaining samurai are spending their final night on earth. The air is thick with the smell of mold, whetstone, gangrenous wounds, and the sweet, heavy scent of incense. These men have no illusions left. They know that the imperial commander, General Yamagata Aritomo, who was once Saigo's close comrade during the revolution, has sent a final, respectful letter imploring his old master to surrender and save his life. You watch Saigo receive the letter in the dim light of a candle. He reads the words of his former student with a quiet, gentle smile, then sets the paper aside without writing a reply. To surrender would be to admit that their protest was merely a political dispute, a common crime against the state. To die here, under the open sky, is to elevate their struggle into an eternal testament of the warrior spirit. The men do not spend these final hours plotting a desperate, cowardly escape. Instead, a surreal, heartbreaking serenity settles over the camp. Someone brings out a traditional, three-stringed lute, a biwa, and its sharp, melancholic notes begin to drift through the damp air. Mingling with the sound of the wind in the cypresses, the warriors take turns reciting classical poetry, laughing softly about the memories of their youth, and carefully combing their hair, using the last of their fragrant hair oil to scent their top knots so they will not smell of decay when the enemy finds their bodies at dawn. You observe Saigo sitting at the mouth of his cave, his massive frame silhouetted against the dark blue expanse of Kagoshima Bay far below. His body is broken by the long campaign, his legs are swollen from filariasis, and his old sword wound throbs constantly in the damp night air. Yet, his mind has reached a state of absolute, crystalline clarity, the perfect embodiment of Mushin, the Zen state of no mind, where the barrier between life and death completely dissolves. He looks out at the distant, black shape of Mount Sakurajima, the active volcano that has dominated the horizon of his entire life, occasionally puffing a silent plume of ash into the night sky. He realizes that his lifelong quest to preserve the moral core of his country is about to achieve its ultimate purpose. He has realized that a living Saigo Takamori would always be a source of dangerous, chaotic division for Japan, a rallying cry for endless civil war. But a dead Saigo, sacrificed on the altar of honor, will become an immortal myth, a permanent, unyielding conscience that will haunt the modern nation forever, forcing every future generation of Japanese leaders to look back and question whether they have traded their ancient soul for mere material gain. You do feel the very earth tremble at exactly 3:55 in the morning as the sky begins to turn the color of bruised iron. The silence of the mountain is instantly obliterated by the roar of 60 Imperial artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously from the valleys below. It is a terrifying, continuous wall of thunder that transforms the ridge into a roaring inferno of flying rock, shattered wood, and screaming metal. The Imperial Army does not risk a close-quarters infantry charge against the legendary swordsmen of Satsuma. They rely on the cold, mechanical efficiency of industrial firepower, raining thousands of pounds of lead and iron onto the peak. For 3 agonizing hours, the bombardment tears the top of the mountain to pieces. Saigo's men crouch in their shallow trenches, their ears bleeding from the concussive force of the blasts, waiting for the iron rain to stop. When the artillery finally goes silent at 6 o'clock, the morning mist parts to reveal a terrifying sight. 3 dense columns of Imperial infantry, their bayonets fixed and gleaming in the early morning light, are advancing up the slopes from 3 different directions, like an unstoppable wave of dark blue ink. You watch the final, glorious and suicidal counteroffensive of the samurai class. Saigo stands up from his wooden stool, draws his katana one last time with his stiff right arm, and looks down at the remaining 40 men who are still able to stand. There are no orders given, no grand speeches delivered. With a single, collective roar that sounds like a dying lion, the last samurai fling themselves out of their trenches and charge headlong down the rocky slope directly into the teeth of the advancing Imperial lines. They do not seek cover. They do not fire their few remaining rifles. They run forward with their swords raised high, their kimonos fluttering in the mountain wind like the wings of predatory birds. It is a moment of pure, terrifying kinetic energy. The Imperial conscripts, despite their modern training and numerical superiority, are gripped by a primal, ancestral terror at the sight of these legendary warriors rushing toward them. The front line breaks in panic as the Satsuma swordsmen close the distance, their blades flashing in the morning sun, cutting through flesh and rifles with a brutal, fluid ease that has been perfected over 7 centuries of martial tradition. You witness the exact, tragic moment that brings an end to an entire epoch of human history as Saigo leads his men through a hail of rifle fire near the gate of a local estate. A volley of modern minié balls rips through the air. One bullet strikes him squarely in the hip, another tears through his lower abdomen. His massive body collapses into the wet grass, his blood soaking deep into the dark soil of his homeland. His loyal lieutenant, Beppu Shinsuke, rushes to his side through the smoke, lifting his master's heavy shoulders into his arms. Saigo looks up at his old disciple, his breathing shallow, his face completely pale, but his large eyes remain perfectly calm. Free of pain or regret, he speaks his final words with a quiet, fading whisper. Dear Shinsuke, this is far enough. Let us end it here. You watch as Saigo straightens his spine with an immense, agonizing effort, crossing his legs to face east toward the distant imperial palace in Tokyo. He bows his head in a final gesture of deep, unyielding respect to the emperor he loved, but could no longer follow. He raises his short dagger to perform seppuku, the ritual suicide that allows a samurai to preserve his honor in defeat by opening his own belly, but his physical strength fails him. His hands tremble against the blade. Beppu Shinsuke understands his duty instantly. He draws his long sword, his eyes filled with tears, and takes his position behind his master. With a single, powerful, and practiced downward stroke, the steel cuts through the air, severing Saigo's head and bringing a clean, merciful end to his suffering. Shinsuke hands the severed head to a trusted servant with explicit orders to hide it deep in the forest so the enemy cannot defile it or display it as a common trophy. Then, turning toward the advancing imperial lines, Shinsuke and the remaining handful of samurai draw their swords and charge one last time into the wall of fire. Dying to the last man under a hail of modern bullets. As the smoke slowly clears from the ridge of Shiroyama, the silence returns to the mountain, heavy and absolute. The last samurai is gone, and the long, uninterrupted sunset of the old world has finally given way to the cold, industrial night of the modern age. You are drifting through the shifting, surreal landscape of a memory that belongs not to a single man, but to an entire civilization standing on the precipice of an identity crisis. The physical world of 1877 has dissolved, but its ghost remains completely suspended in the cold air of the late 19th century. Imagine the sensation of walking through an ancient cedar forest at midnight, where the roots beneath your feet run deep into a soil that has been nourished by the blood of 1,000 generations of warriors, while the distant, unnatural orange glow of the city's new gas lamps flickers weakly against the horizon. This is the liminal space where the old world refuses to fully die, and where the new world realizes, with a creeping sense of existential dread, that it can never truly escape the shadow of the things it chose to murder in the name of progress. You can hear the steady, rhythmic dripping of condensation from the dark, mossy roof of a cave in the hills overlooking Kagoshima. The sound is agonizingly slow, a natural clock ticking away the seconds of an era that has already drawn its last official breath. In the absolute darkness of this forest, the silence feels heavy, thick, and almost alive, like the held breath of a giant. When a nation undergoes a revolution as violent and total as the Meiji Restoration, the wounds do not heal cleanly when the treaties are signed or the battlefields are cleared. They fester in the quiet spaces. They linger in the hearts of mothers who lost their sons to modern conscript rifles, and they haunt the dreams of the politicians in Tokyo who now sit in their imported leather chairs, listening to the unfamiliar tick of European grandfather clocks. They have achieved the modernization they screamed for, but as you look closely at their pale, anxious faces, through the fog of history, you see that they are terrified of the silence they have created. You find yourself observing a solitary figure walking along the rocky coastline of the Southern Sea, where the dark volcanic sand meets the cold, white foam of the Pacific. This is not the Grand General Saigo Takamori, as the history books record him, nor is it the rebel leader crucified by the state newspapers. This is the internal, psychological reality of a man who spent his entire existence trying to reconcile two completely incompatible worlds. Even in death, his presence on this coast is immense, a heavy atmospheric pressure that seems to bend the very wind to its will. He walks with a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon where the dark ocean breaks against the sky. He is carrying the invisible weight of every single promise he ever made to the people of Japan. Promises of a nation that would grow strong without losing its kindness, a country that would master the iron machines of the West without trading its ancestral soul for a handful of foreign gold. You begin to feel the true, agonizing depth of the isolation that defines the aftermath of this tragedy. When a revolutionary movement succeeds in tearing down an old tyranny, the men who led the charge are almost always destroyed by the very momentum they unleashed. Saigo was not a victim of his enemies. He was a victim of his own success. He built the modern imperial army to protect Japan from being colonized by European empires, but that very army became a cold, unfeeling bureaucratic machine that turned its guns inward, slaughtering the very samurai who gave it life. This is the ultimate paradox of progress. The tools we create to defend our freedom often become the chains that bind our spirits. As you watch the phantom waves crash against the black rocks of Satsuma, you realize that Saigo's entire life was an attempt to stand between the hammer of modernity and the anvil of tradition, allowing his own body to be crushed so that the spark of the ancient ways might survive the impact. You notice how the physical details of the land seem to echo this internal fragmentation. In the village squares of Satsuma, the old weapon racks stand completely empty, their dark wood polished smooth by generations of calloused hands that are now buried in the mountain soil. The local people move through their daily routines with a quiet, subdued solemnity, their voices lowered out of respect for the ghosts that still occupy the hills. When they look up at the ridge of Shiroyama, they do not see a sight of treason or defeat. They see a sacred altar where the moral purity of their entire province was preserved through an act of total self-erasure. They remember Saigo not as a politician who failed to secure a government seat, but as a gentle giant who used to walk among their farms, helping them carry heavy loads of wood, sharing his food with their hungry children, and reminding them that a person's true value is measured solely by their sincerity and their willingness to endure suffering on behalf of others. You follow the dark, winding path of the imperial investigators who were sent from Tokyo in the weeks following the battle to document the end of the rebellion. They move through the pristine forests with a sense of profound discomfort, their heavy leather boots slipping on the damp moss, their modern wool uniforms catching on the sharp briars of the underbrush. They carry clipboards, ledgers, and scientific instruments, attempting to reduce a grand spiritual tragedy to a collection of numbers, names, and topographical measurements. They are looking for Saigo's hidden grave, searching for the severed head that his loyal followers buried deep within the earth to prevent it from being displayed as a trophy of war. But the forest refuses to cooperate with their bureaucratic demands. The wind howling through the ancient cedars sounds like a low, mocking laugh, and every time the investigators think they have found a clue, the fog rolls in from the bay, thick and blinding, wiping away their footprints and leaving them lost in a maze of green and shadow. You understand that the government in Tokyo was not trying to find Saigo's remains out of malice. They were driven by a desperate psychological need for closure. They needed a physical body to prove to themselves that the old world was truly dead. As long as Saigo's head remained missing, as long as his final resting place stayed hidden within the sacred earth of Satsuma, he remained an active, terrifying threat to their new order. He was no longer a mortal man who could be shot imprisoned, or reasoned with. He had broken free from the constraints of flesh and blood to become an omnipresent national conscience. Every time a new factory opened its doors, every time a traditional festival was banned to make way for a Western holiday, and every time a politician accepted a bribe from a wealthy industrialist, the ghost of Saigo Takamori would stand in the shadows, his large dark eyes staring in silent judgment, asking a question that no official in the capital knew how to answer. You watch the transition of the seasons as the autumn rain turns into the bitter, silent frost of winter across the high peaks of Kyushu. The cold settles into the deep valleys, wrapping the thatched roofs of the old samurai houses in a delicate, fragile layer of ice that glitters like diamonds in the pale moonlight. In these quiet, freezing nights, the elder storytellers of the villages gather the young children around the low charcoal braziers, their voices dropping to a soft, rhythmic whisper that mimics the sound of the wind outside. They do not tell stories of Western achievements, or the building of railroads, or the grand victories of the Imperial Navy. Instead, they tell the legend of the giant who loved the mountains, the warrior who could not bear to see a child cry, and the leader who chose to throw away the highest office in the empire because he refused to live a life of comfortable compromise. Through these spoken words, passed from lip to ear in the dark hours of the night, Saigo is reborn every winter, his memory kept warm and vibrant within the hearts of a generation that will grow up in a world he never got to see. You allow your mind to drift deeper into the absolute stillness of this historical twilight, where the distinction between the past and the present begins to blur into a single, unified consciousness. The world outside your room may be rushing forward with its relentless noise, its digital screens, and its endless, superficial demands on your attention. But here, in the shadow of Shiroyama, time has completely stopped. You can feel the cool, refreshing air of the mountain filling your lungs, clearing away the mental clutter of the modern day, leaving behind only a profound sense of peace and perspective. The struggles of Saigo Takamori and his 300 warriors were not in vain. They created a permanent sanctuary in time, a place where any weary soul can retreat, to remember what it means to be truly human, to be guided by an inner compass that cannot be bought, sold, or broken by the shifting tides of history. You can feel your eyelids growing heavier now, the gentle, hypnotic rhythm of the story wrapping itself around your thoughts like a soft silk kimono. The long campaigns are over. The ink on the historical ledgers has dried, and the ghosts of Satsuma have finally found their way back into the deep, welcoming embrace of the earth. The sky above the mountains remains a deep, velvet blue, studded with infinite stars that have watched the rise and fall of empires with the same calm, unblinking indifference. There are no more battles to fight, no more compromises to refuse, and no more weights to carry upon your shoulders. The story has done its work. The giant is at rest, and the silence of the forest is inviting you to let go of the last remnants of the waking world, to surrender completely to the dark, and to step safely into the deep, undisturbed luxury of a long and beautiful sleep. You are sinking deeper into the absolute, timeless belly of the southern mountains, far beneath the superficial layers of historical facts, dates, and political treaties. The world of human speech has grown faint now, replaced by the deep, primordial architecture of the earth itself. Imagine the sensation of floating within a vast, subterranean chamber beneath the roots of Mount Sakurajima, where the ancient heat of the planet pulses with a slow, heavy heartbeat, a rhythm that existed millions of years before the first samurai ever drew a blade, and one that will continue long after the modern cities of stone and glass have crumbled back into dust. This is the bedrock of Satsuma, the dark volcanic womb that nurtured the spirit of Saigo Takamori, and it is here that the true, unedited essence of his tragedy finds its final, permanent resting place. You can hear the low, majestic sigh of the earth moving through the deep fissures of the rock, a sound that mimics the breath of a sleeping giant. The air down here is warm, dark, and still, completely untouched by the biting winter frosts or the chaotic storms that periodically tear across the surface of the hills. In this profound darkness, your mind is freed from the frantic necessity of moving forward, of achieving things, of constantly reacting to the endless demands of a noisy world. You are permitted to simply exist, to let your thoughts dissolve into the ancient silence like ash settling on the slopes of a volcano. The march of time, which seemed so urgent and terrifying to the politicians in Tokyo and the warriors on the ridge, is revealed to be nothing more than a momentary ripple on the surface of an infinite, calm ocean. You perceive the spirit of Saigo not as a historical ghost wandering the battlefields, but as an intrinsic part of this volcanic landscape. He was never truly suited for the sterile wood-paneled offices of the Tokyo ministries or the rigid, mechanical legalism of the modern state. He belonged to the raw, uncarved elements of nature, to the heavy rains, the dense mountain mists, and the dark, fertile soil that demands absolute sincerity from those who cultivate it. When he returned to Kagoshima after his political exile from the government, he was not retreating from life, he was returning to the source of his strength, reconnecting with the deep telluric energies that had formed his character since childhood. He understood that a human being who disconnects from the earth, who trades the sky and the soil for the artificial security of a city, becomes a hollow shell, a leaf torn from its branch and blown away by the first cold wind of crisis. You observe the long, quiet nights in the rural villages of Satsuma, years after the war has officially ended, when the light of the moon reflects off the black volcanic sand of the beaches, creating a scenery that looks like a painting made of silver and shadow. In these moments, the line between what is real and what is myth ceases to matter entirely. The old women who sit on the wooden verandas, weaving traditional silk thread by the light of a single candle, do not speak of Saigo as someone who is dead and buried in a cemetery. They speak of him as an ongoing presence, an atmospheric quality that you can feel in the air just before a major harvest, or a protective warmth that shields the valleys from the harshest typhoons blowing in from the south. They know that you cannot kill a man who has successfully infused his soul into the collective consciousness of his people. His body may be gone, but his values have become a permanent part of the local language, expressed in every act of quiet generosity, every uncomplaining endurance of hardship, and every smile shared between neighbors in the fields. You begin to recognize that this absolute, unyielding devotion to sincerity, what Saigo called Makoto, is the true legacy that outlived the swords and the cannons of the 19th century. Sincerity is not a political strategy. It cannot be codified into a law or manufactured in an industrial factory. It is a rare, delicate state of being where a person's inner thoughts, spoken words, and physical actions are in perfect, flawless alignment, completely free of vanity, self-interest, or fear of consequences. It is the quality that made Saigo completely incomprehensible to the cynical, pragmatic politicians in the capital, who viewed life as a series of calculations, deals, and tactical compromises. To them, a man who was willing to die simply to preserve the moral purity of an ideal was a madman, a dangerous anachronism that had to be eliminated. But as you look back at them through the clear lens of history, you see that their victories have grown cold and dusty, while Saigo's madness continues to shine with a brilliant, comforting light, serving as a beacon for every soul that feels lost in the mechanical maze of modernity. You walk with the phantoms of the young students who perished on the slopes of Shiroyama, watching them move through the ancient forests, not as angry specters seeking revenge, but as peaceful guardians who have finally been allowed to lay down their weapons. They have shed the blood-stained bandages, the heavy iron swords, and the terrible weight of their months-long retreat. They are young again, their faces smooth and unlined by starvation or despair, their laughter echoing through the trees like the chatter of birds in the early spring. They have realized that their final, desperate charge down the mountain was not a failure. It was a perfect, unblemished moment of completion, a collective leap into eternity that saved them from the slow, agonizing rot of a long life spent in comfortable compromise. They died with their honor entirely intact, their eyes fixed on the massive, reassuring figure of their master, completely satisfied that they had given everything they possessed to the land that had nurtured them. You feel a profound sense of decompression spreading through your own body as you let yourself sink completely into this atmosphere of total resolution. The struggles of history, the grand political debates, the clashes of empires, and the endless anxieties of the human condition are all revealed to be nothing more than a passing play of light and shadow on the wall of a quiet room. You do not need to solve the mysteries of the past, nor do you need to worry about the demands of the future that waits for you outside this space. Here, in the deep volcanic cradle of Satsuma, you are completely safe, completely insulated from the noise and the friction of the world. You are allowed to let go of your defense mechanisms, to relax the muscles of your shoulders, and to let your breathing fall into a slow, effortless harmony with the ancient, rhythmic pulse of the earth below. The darkness of the chamber is soft, warm, and infinitely welcoming, a gentle velvet blanket that absorbs all the residual stress and mental noise of your waking life. The story of Saigo Takamori has reached its ultimate, quiet conclusion, transforming from a violent historical tragedy into a peaceful, timeless lullaby that sings of honor, sincerity, and the deep comfort of returning home to the soil. The rain has stopped on the ridges of Shiroyama. The stars over Kagoshima Bay are beginning to fade as the deep night prepares to yield to the soft, pale gray of a quiet dawn. But you do not need to wake up for that sunrise. You are permitted to stay here in the quiet dark, to let your mind drift away from the last shores of thought, and to slide gently, safely, and deeply into the infinite, undisturbed luxury of a perfect sleep.